In this video, I want to discuss one of the most important secrets to how the mind functions. I think it underlies a lot of the collective anxiety that people are feeling across the globe right now. I don't think it's the only explanation, but I think it's playing a significant part in all of this. And so, in terms of the secret, who else has talked about it? I think it's a very short list. In terms of contemporaries, I would put people like Alan Watts, Aldous Huxley, and Eckhart Tolle as those who have explicitly talked about the oppositional nature of the mind. I talk about this a lot in my videos because I think it's so important. But when I talk about the oppositional nature of the mind, I just mean how when we try to push in one direction, the mind pushes back. So if I say, don't think of the number 13, that's all you can think about. If you desperately have to go to sleep, you're up all night. In sports, if you have to make that shot and everything's depending on it, and you put all your effort into it, you end up missing. Well, a lot of this oppositional nature is just tied to the mind being biological and part of the nervous system. And so when we look at the nervous system, there are all kinds of balancing acts that are happening all the time to maintain what's called homeostasis. And so if your body gets too cold, you'll start to shiver to warm it up. If you get too hot, you start to sweat to bring it down. And so while these processes are simply not discussed very much in modern times, they were absolutely obvious to the ancients. In fact, if you go back to the Tao Te Ching, it talks all about the oppositional nature of the mind and how to deal with it. In fact, the ancient Taoists came up with a concept called Wu Wei, which I've been talking a lot in my videos about because I think it's so important and critical right now. And all Wu Wei means is no effort. Now, to those of us in the West, that sounds very strange and it sounds like giving up or just not even trying, which is like one of the worst things we could do here in the West. But really, it's just an insightful suggestion to those who know the mechanics of the mind. So, how does this fit in with what we're dealing with right now? Well, let's take a real short history of our relationship with mind as a species. Remember that for the vast majority of our species, we were totally identified with mind. We were completely under the spell that these egos were authentic. And only recently has this kind of shell cracked where we started to see the ego as this kind of thought or a ghost of a thought. But some of this started happening in the 60s with Alan Watts. And I think, really, in terms of an unprecedented event, was Eckhart Tolle with his Power Now. He brought this message that you are not mind to more people across the globe than maybe has ever been the case in history. So, how does the mind react? How does the mind react to realizing that we don't buy into its story anymore? Well, it has an opposing process of trying to get us to re identify through its basic mechanisms of fear, anxiety, and panic. Sometimes this process happens when someone ingests psychedelics. And so maybe it's the first time in their life they've experienced the mind at a distance. They recognize they're not mind, but then mind immediately compensates and sends this message of fear, anxiety, and panic. And this person may have what we call a bad trip. Well, what I'm suggesting is that right now, collectively, the planet is experiencing a bad trip. And our bad trip is because we have, for maybe the first time in our history, distanced and recognized the mind for exactly what it is. It is a process, it creates an image of exactly who we're not. And we fell for it for a very, very long time. And then we started waking up. And it was the waking up process that's getting the mind to reestablish itself. And so if you go out right now, so I'm in Pennsylvania in the United States, and if you go out, you see, or you can see stories on the media of people just collectively hoarding, and sometimes strange things like toilet paper. So maybe one day the Freudians will enlighten us as to what was behind that particular example. But you can see the ego collectively trying to reestablish itself through these exact mechanisms of a bad trip: fear, panic, and anxiety. So, how do we incorporate the principle of Wu Wei? Well, you might remember an old 80s movie called War Games, and it really demonstrated this principle very nicely. So it was a computer, and it was running the simulations about two countries that were superpowers, and they got into a war, which was, of course, unwinnable because the only outcome was self-annihilation. And the computer had this very brilliant insight, very ancient Taoist insight, that the only way to win is to not play the game. And I think that's where we find ourselves right now. The way to win is to not play the game. How do you not play? Well, I'm going to give you another take on this before I wrap it up. There's a wonderful saying from the Stoics that's very similar to this principle of Wu Wei, and it's this idea that the obstacle is the way. In other words, you use the game and the idea that um, the more effort I put into trying to win, the more likely I am to lose. You use that knowledge as a way out. Um, I try not to bring up Star Trek too much, but I can't help myself. So the next generation was filled with so many wonderful examples of every time they would crank up the shields, um, the shock wave would intensify. Anytime they cranked up the warp engines to get out of some trap, the trap just sunk them in deeper and deeper. And they realized this principle of Wu Wei. The only way to get out was to turn off the engines or to take the shields down. And so that's what we're experiencing right now. And so the fact that we have this opportunity right now to see the mind in its oppositional nature, see it as it's trying so desperately to reestablish itself, gives us an even deeper opportunity, an even um, kind of more precious moment where we can further our progress of disidentifying with mind. But the trick is to not play in the first place. And we have all kinds of ways to not play. I mean, meditation, mindfulness, Tai Chi, any form of meditation, any form of not buying into the ego story is a way of not playing the game. And so I think that is one of the major secrets to how the mind operates. And I think uh, the obstacle is the way. And that's a amazing opportunity for us right now. So let me know what you think.